The alien princess blinked in surprise, "You ray taking me," as your partner, human Jace Wells, wasn't used to being surprised. As a human commander with years of military experience, he had seen his fair share of chaotic situations. But when the alien princess, Celera, appeared before him in the crowded, bustling marketplace of Valthar, he was thrown off balance. The Valthar Empire had always been a mystery. The alien species had technology that was light years ahead of humanity. Yet they were isolated, keeping their distance from the rest of the galaxy. Jace had been sent as a diplomatic envoy to meet with the Valthar leaders and discuss the possibility of an alliance. But he wasn't prepared for what happened next. Jace had just entered the Grand Market Square, a massive open space filled with vendors selling strange fruits, glowing fabrics, and holographic trinkets. The air smelled of spices he couldn't name, and the sounds of alien chatter filled his ears. The marketplace was alive with energy, but Jace couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He had only taken a few steps when he noticed the commotion. It started with a sudden shout from the crowd, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Before he could react, a figure darted past him, her face hidden beneath a veil of shimmering fabric. Jace instinctively reached out, grabbing her arm to steady her as she nearly stumbled into him. "Hey, careful," he said, his voice calm but firm. The woman blinked in surprise, her eyes wide beneath the veil. She didn't seem to recognize him, but there was something about the way she carried herself, like she was accustomed to being in control of every situation. And yet in that moment she looked vulnerable. "Release me," she demanded, her voice cool and authoritative. Jace frowned. The Valthar had a reputation for being aloof and cold, but this was different. He let go of her arm, but his curiosity had been piqued. There was no mistaking the air of nobility that surrounded her. This wasn't just any random Valthar woman, she was someone important. Before he could ask any more questions, a sudden crash interrupted the moment. The crowd screamed in panic as a group of heavily armored figures stormed the marketplace, their weapons drawn. The figure in front of Jace, who he now recognized as the princess, tensed. Without warning, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small device, pressing it against her wrist. A sharp, hissing sound followed, and a blade extended from the device. "Get down," she ordered, her voice cold and commanding. Jace didn't need to be told twice. He ducked just as the princess swung the blade with precision, cutting through the air with expert accuracy. The attackers didn't stand a chance, but Jace wasn't a passive observer. He had been trained to react quickly, to think on his feet. He grabbed a nearby crate and used it as a shield, moving toward the princess. They needed to escape, and quickly. "Come on," Jace shouted, pulling her along as they ran toward an alley at the edge of the market. The princess didn't hesitate, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps gratitude, perhaps recognition. As they ducked into the narrow alley, Jace noticed the sleek design of her armor hidden beneath her veil. She wasn't just royalty, she was a warrior. They ran for several minutes, the sounds of pursuit growing distant but still loud enough to be unsettling. Eventually, they found a secluded spot behind a pile of crates, hidden from view. Jace took a moment to catch his breath, his heart racing from the adrenaline. He glanced at the princess, who was composed, though her eyes were sharp and calculating. "Who were they?" Jace asked, his voice low. The princess took a deep breath, adjusting her cloak. "Enemies of the Valthar crown, assassins sent to eliminate me." Jace raised an eyebrow. "Why would someone want to kill a princess?" She met his gaze. "Not just any princess. I am Celera, heir to the Valthar Empire." Jace blinked. This was no ordinary assassination attempt. He had heard whispers of the Valthar princess, rumors about her intelligence, her strength, and her determination. But this was the first time he had seen her in person, and now he was caught up in her dangerous world, whether he liked it or not. "Then we need to get you to safety," Jace said, his voice firm. "Come with me." Celera shook her head. "I can't. My life is not my own. If I flee, it will only make things worse for my people." Jace didn't know what to say to that. He had seen countless leaders make impossible decisions, but this was different. She wasn't just a leader, she was a symbol of her people's future. "We'll figure something out," Jace said, though he wasn't sure how. "But right now, you're in danger. We need to get out of here before those assassins find us again." Celera looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jace thought she might refuse, but then she nodded. "Fine, lead the way." They moved swiftly through the narrow alleyways, trying to stay out of sight. As they passed through the streets of the alien city, Jace couldn't help but notice how different everything was here. The architecture was sleek and futuristic, with towering spires that reached toward the sky. The people walked with purpose, their eyes never straying from their paths. And yet, amidst the beauty of it all, Jace felt a sense of tension hanging in the air. Eventually, they found refuge in an old, abandoned building. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hide them for a short while. Jace and Solara sat in the shadows, catching their breath. "How did they find you?" Jace asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Solara hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't know. I've been on the run for weeks, ever since I refused to marry a prince from a rival house. My father," she paused, her voice faltering. "He doesn't understand why I would defy tradition, but I can't marry someone I don't love." Jace didn't say anything at first. He had been raised in a world where duty and loyalty were valued above all else, but he understood the desire for freedom. He had fought for his own freedom in the past, and now he was fighting for hers. "We'll get you out of here," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I promise." Solara's eyes softened, and for the first time since they met, Jace saw a flicker of warmth in her gaze. "Thank you." The weight of the moment hung between them, and for a brief second, it felt like they were more than just two strangers caught in a dangerous game. They were allies, partners in a fight for survival, but the battle was far from over. And Jace knew that the stakes were much higher than either of them could have imagined. Jace and Solara had barely settled into the abandoned building when the sound of footsteps outside made both of them freeze. Jace's hand instinctively went to the blaster at his side, while Solara's eyes narrowed in concentration. They were both alert, their minds racing with possibilities. Whoever was outside wasn't here by chance. "Stay low," Jace whispered, his voice barely a sound. Solara nodded, her hand moving to the hidden weapon at her wrist, the same blade she had used earlier in the marketplace. She looked at him, her gaze steady. Jace couldn't help but notice the calm determination in her eyes. There was something about her, something he hadn't expected from the princess he had been briefed on. She wasn't just royalty, she was a fighter, someone who had clearly dealt with danger before. The footsteps stopped just outside their hiding place. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Jace tensed, his hand still resting on his weapon. Every muscle in his body was on edge, waiting for the slightest movement. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed from down the hallway. The sound of voices, followed by more footsteps, confirmed what Jace had feared. They were closing in. "Move," he ordered, grabbing Solara's arm and pulling her into the shadows. He wasn't sure how they would escape, but they had no choice. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, but the building was a maze of hallways and rooms, some familiar, others strange and abandoned. They ran through the crumbling structure, moving as quietly as possible. Jace's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. The building was old, its walls made of thick stone that was crumbling in some places. There were no windows to escape through, and the only door leading outside was far from where they stood. They needed to get out before the hunters found them. Solara didn't speak, but Jace could feel her presence beside him. She was fast, her feet barely making a sound as they moved deeper into the building. Her movements were graceful, calculated, each step taken with purpose. Jace couldn't help but be impressed. She had been trained, and not just in the way of diplomacy or royal duties. She had a side to her that was far more dangerous than anyone had led him to believe. Finally, they came to a large, open room. The door at the far end was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling through. Jace motioned for Solara to follow him. The escape wasn't far, but he knew they would have to be careful. Just as they reached the door, a voice called out from behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the floor. Jace turned, pushing Solara into the shadows, just as a group of armed Valthar soldiers appeared at the far end of the hallway. They were searching the building, their eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The moment they stepped into the room, Jace knew they would be trapped. "We're outnumbered," Jace muttered, his mind calculating their options. There was no way they could fight their way out, not in this narrow space, not with so many opponents. Solara looked at him, her face set in determination. "Then we run." Before Jace could respond, she was moving. Her legs carried her quickly and quietly through the shadows, her speed almost unnatural. Jace hesitated for a moment, watching her as she disappeared into the dark hallway. He followed quickly, but not without a glance over his shoulder. The soldiers hadn't seen them yet, but it wouldn't be long before they realized they were gone. They ran through a series of dark hallways, passing through rooms filled with broken furniture and empty crates. The place was a relic from a past long forgotten, a structure that had been left to rot, while the city outside grew into the empire it was today. Jace's breath came in heavy gasps, his mind working through the options they had left. He had no idea where they were going, but all he could think about was keeping Solara safe. She might be a princess, but she was also the target of a deadly game that had been set in motion long before they met. And as much as he hated to admit it, Jace knew he was involved now, whether he liked it or not. At the far end of the building, they finally reached a large door that led out to a narrow alley. Jace pushed it open slowly, checking for any signs of danger before stepping outside. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but it was a welcome change from the stale, musty air inside. They were free for now. Jace looked at Solara, his heart still pounding in his chest. "We can't stay here long," he said. "We need to move before the soldiers catch up with us." Solara nodded, her expression unreadable. "I know," she replied, her voice cool as ever. "But where will we go?" Jace paused. He didn't have an answer. They were deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile factions, and their chances of escaping without being caught were slim. But there was one thing Jace knew for sure. He wasn't going to let her go down without a fight. "We'll figure it out," Jace said, his voice firm. "We'll find a way." Solara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a brief moment, Jace thought she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she turned and started walking down the alley. Jace followed, keeping a close eye on their surroundings. They didn't speak as they walked, both of them lost in their thoughts. It wasn't long before they reached a small, dimly lit street. The sounds of the city seemed distant here, muffled by the narrow alleyways and tall buildings that surrounded them. But Jace wasn't fooled. They were still in danger. The Valthar soldiers could be anywhere, and the assassins were still after Solara. "We need to find a safe house," Jace said, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. "Somewhere we can lay low until we figure out what to do next." Solara didn't respond at first, but after a moment she spoke. "I know a place." Jace raised an eyebrow. "How do you know?" Solara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I've been running from assassins for weeks. I know where to go when I need to hide." Jace didn't ask any more questions. They didn't have time for them. They had to move quickly, and every second counted. As they turned down another narrow street, Jace couldn't help but wonder about the woman walking beside him. She was a princess, a leader of her people, and yet here she was, on the run, hiding in the shadows, just like him. He didn't know what her future held, but he was beginning to understand that Solara was more than just the heir to a throne. She was a woman who would stop at nothing to protect what she loved, even if it meant defying everything she had ever known. And Jace was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, he was willing to stand by her, no matter the cost. Jace and Solara moved swiftly through the city streets, their footsteps echoing softly against the cold, stone pavement. The night was quiet, but Jace knew better than to relax. He could feel the weight of the danger pressing in around them. Even though they had managed to escape the immediate threat, they were still deep in enemy territory. The Valthar soldiers would be relentless, and Jace had no doubt that more assassins were already tracking their every move. The city of Valthar was unlike anything Jace had ever seen. Its towering spires loomed over the streets, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. The buildings were sleek and elegant, their surfaces smooth and reflective. Yet beneath the city's beauty lay an undercurrent of tension, a feeling that everything was on the edge of collapse. It was a city of power and secrecy, and Jace had been thrust into its heart, caught between politics and betrayal. Solara walked beside him, her pace steady and confident despite the danger they were in. She moved like someone who had been trained for this kind of life. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. She was not the princess he had expected, fragile and helpless, but a woman who had seen the darker sides of her own empire and knew how to survive. They turned down another narrow alley, and Jace glanced around to make sure they weren't being followed. The streets had emptied as they moved deeper into the city's quieter districts, and the silence around them felt almost unnatural. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic marketplace where they had first met, but Jace knew the calm was only temporary. "How much farther?" Jace asked, his voice low. Solara didn't look at him, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "Not much. The safe house is just ahead." They walked in silence for a few more minutes before Celera suddenly stopped, holding up her hand. Jace instinctively slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut. Celera turned to face him, her face expressionless. "We're being watched." Jace's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need her to tell him. He had felt it too. There was something off about the shadows around them, something that didn't sit right. He could hear faint whispers on the wind, the rustle of clothing, the soft scrape of boots against stone. They weren't alone. "Get ready," Jace muttered, his hand moving to his blaster. He glanced around for an escape route, but the alley was narrow and seemed to dead end. There was nowhere to run. Without a word, Celera stepped closer to him, her posture stiff and alert. She was ready for whatever was coming, but Jace couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This wasn't just an ordinary assassination attempt. There was something personal about this. The hunters were closing in, and they weren't going to stop until they had Celera. The silence stretched for a long moment before a figure emerged from the shadows ahead of them. A tall, hooded man, his face hidden beneath the fabric of his cloak. Jace instinctively raised his blaster, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figure's movements. "Stay calm," Jace whispered to Celera, his grip tightening on the weapon. The figure didn't speak, but Jace could feel the weight of his gaze even from behind the hood. The man took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, as if he were testing them. Jace's instincts screamed that this wasn't a random encounter. This man was here for a reason. Before Jace could react, the man spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Princess Celera, you are not as safe as you think." Jace's grip on his blaster tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Who are you?" The man chuckled softly, the sound almost chilling. "A friend, Commander Wells. Or perhaps a foe, that depends on how you see it." Jace took a step forward, his eyes scanning the figure for any sign of threat. "I don't have time for riddles. Who sent you?" The man's eyes gleamed beneath his hood, and for a brief moment, Jace caught a glimpse of something dark and calculating. "The same people who want your princess dead." Jace's heart skipped a beat. He knew the Valthar political landscape was a tangled web, but this was something else. Someone had placed a bounty on Celera's life, and it was clear that the assassination attempts were no accident. "Why are you helping us?" Jace asked, his voice suspicious. If this man was part of the group hunting them, then his motives were anything but clear. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "I'm not helping you, Commander. I'm here to make sure the princess doesn't end up dead before her time." Jace didn't like where this conversation was heading. "Then why are you talking to us?" The man's laugh was cold and humorless. "Because, Commander, I've made a deal, one that could change the fate of your entire mission." Jace glanced at Celera, her expression unreadable. She was clearly on edge, but she hadn't said a word. Jace knew she was processing everything, weighing her options, and from the look in her eyes, she wasn't trusting this stranger any more than he was. "What kind of deal?" Jace asked, narrowing his eyes. The man stepped closer, his movements slow and measured. "A deal that will allow you to protect the princess. A deal that will give you the power you need to fight back, but it will come at a cost." Jace didn't like the sound of that. Deals in this galaxy rarely turned out well. "What kind of cost?" The man's eyes glittered with something Jace couldn't quite place. "You'll have to trust me, Commander, for now at least." Jace didn't answer immediately. He weighed the man's words, considering their options. Celera was still watching the man, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She didn't trust him, but Jace could see that she wasn't dismissing him either. "We don't have the luxury of trust right now," Jace said finally, keeping his voice steady. "If you want our help, you'll have to earn it. We're not making any deals until we know more." The man seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Commander. But remember this, the Valthar Empire is in turmoil, and your mission is about to get a lot more complicated." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had come. Jace and Celera stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling over them. "Well, that was unsettling," Jace muttered, looking around once more to make sure they weren't being followed. Celera didn't respond right away. She was still looking down the alley, her mind clearly racing. Jace could tell she was processing everything, the encounter, the threat, and what it all meant for her future. "We have no choice but to trust him for now," she said quietly. "We have no allies left." Jace nodded slowly. He didn't like it, but he couldn't deny the truth of her words. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. And whatever deal this mysterious man had offered, they would have to take the risk. Let's get to that safe house, Jace said, his voice resolute. We'll figure this out together. Solara nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. There was no turning back now. The game had changed, and they were both players in it. The streets of Valthar were eerily quiet, almost too quiet. Jace and Solara moved through the shadows, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The city seemed to have taken on a different feeling since their last escape. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a tension that neither of them could shake. The mysterious man's words echoed in Jace's mind. The Valthar Empire is in turmoil, and your mission is about to get a lot more complicated. The safe house wasn't far now. It was an old, nondescript building tucked away in a corner of the city's less traveled streets. Solara had insisted on leading the way, and Jace didn't question her. She knew this place, and at this point, he trusted her judgment more than his own. As they approached the door, Solara hesitated for a moment. The faint glow of the city's lights cast long shadows across her face, making her look more like a stranger than the princess she truly was. Her expression was unreadable, her mind clearly working through everything that had happened. "Are you sure about this?" Jace asked, his voice low. Solara nodded without looking at him. "We have no other option." Jace didn't argue. He knew she was right. The encounter with the hooded man had shaken them both, but they couldn't afford to waste time questioning motives. They needed a plan, and fast. The Valthar soldiers would be closing in on them soon, and the bounty on Solara's life was only growing. The door creaked open as Solara unlocked it. Inside, the room was dimly lit, its furnishings sparse and utilitarian. It didn't look like much, but Jace could tell that it had been well kept. There were signs of life here, though it was clear that no one had stayed for long. This place wasn't a home, it was a hiding spot, a temporary refuge for someone running from the law. As they stepped inside, Solara moved toward a small table in the corner where a stack of old papers lay. She picked them up carefully, her fingers brushing over the yellowed edges. Jace watched her for a moment but didn't speak. She was focused, her attention on the task at hand. "They'll come for us," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They'll never stop until I'm dead." Jace stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. He didn't like the direction this conversation was going, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. The Valthar Empire was vast, and their enemies were everywhere. The fact that Solara had survived this long was a testament to her strength, but Jace knew it wouldn't be enough to keep her safe forever. "We'll keep moving," Jace said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We'll find a way out." Solara didn't respond right away. She was still looking at the papers in her hands, her brow furrowed in thought. Jace could see the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The life of an empire rested on her shoulders, and she knew it. The stakes were higher than ever before. "We can't run forever," Solara said, her voice steady but tinged with something darker. "I'll never be free if I keep running. The Valthar Empire needs change, but I can't do it alone." Jace stayed quiet for a moment, watching her closely. He knew what she meant. The Valthar Empire was built on centuries of tradition, and change, true change, was something that only a ruler with enough power could bring about. But Solara was more than just a ruler. She was a symbol of rebellion, a symbol of the possibility of a new future. "I don't know how to fix an empire," Jace said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "But I can help you fight." Solara looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. Maybe she was looking for hope, or maybe she was trying to make sense of what they had become. Either way, Jace could feel the weight of her gaze. "You don't have to do this," Solara said softly. "You're not part of this, you're not part of my world." Jace shook his head. "Maybe not, but I'm here now, and I don't leave people behind." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of everything they had been through. Jace could see the conflict in Solara's eyes. She wanted to trust him, but she also knew that trusting him meant something more. It meant involving him in a fight that might end in failure, in death, in destruction. Finally, Solara spoke, her voice low but resolute. "Then we fight." Jace nodded, his heart racing. This was it. There was no going back now. The fight was just beginning. They spent the next few hours strategizing, using the old papers and maps to figure out their next move. Jace was impressed by Solara's quick thinking. She knew the Empire inside and out, and she was determined to find a way to turn the tide in their favor. She spoke with a fire that Jace hadn't seen before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger. By the time dawn broke over the city, they had a plan. It was risky, maybe even foolish, but it was the only option they had left. Solara would make her way to the heart of the Valthar Empire, to the royal court, where she would confront her father, the emperor, and demand the changes that were long overdue. It wouldn't be easy, and Jace knew the risks, but he also knew that there was no other choice. He had seen too much to turn back now. Before they left the safe house, Jace turned to Solara one last time. She was adjusting her cloak, preparing to step out into the dangerous streets once again. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Solara met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I have to be." Jace nodded. He knew she was right. They both had to be sure. This was their only shot at making a difference. As they stepped out into the early morning light, the streets of Valthar felt different. The air was charged with anticipation, and the weight of their decision hung over them like a shadow. They were headed straight into the heart of enemy territory, where every step would be a gamble. But Jace didn't fear the danger anymore. He feared the possibility of failure. And he wasn't about to let that happen. They walked side by side, knowing that they were no longer just two individuals. They were a team, and together they would face whatever came next. The sun was beginning to rise over Valthar, casting a pale orange light across the city. The streets were still quiet, but Jace could feel the tension building in the air. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This time the stakes were higher. Beside him, Solara moved with the same calm determination that had guided them through the past days. She wasn't the frightened princess he had first met in the marketplace. She had become something else, a leader, a force to be reckoned with. The fear that had once clouded her eyes had been replaced by a sharp focus. She was ready to face whatever came next. They made their way through the back alleys of the city, staying out of sight as much as possible. The royal court was only a few blocks away, but every corner they turned felt like a potential threat. Jace couldn't help but feel the weight of the enemy closing in. They were being watched. He was sure of it. "Do you think they'll be waiting for us?" Jace asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Solara glanced at him, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "They'll be expecting us, but they won't know when or where we'll strike." Jace didn't respond. He knew she was right. The element of surprise was their only advantage. They couldn't afford to waste it. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves in a narrow street lined with tall, imposing buildings. The royal court was just ahead, its gates towering over them like a monument to power. Jace's heart raced. This was it, the final step. They stopped at the entrance to the court, hidden in the shadows of a tall stone wall. Jace took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. He had no idea what to expect once they crossed through those gates. But he knew one thing for sure: Solara wasn't going down without a fight. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. Solara nodded. "Let's finish this." They moved quickly, slipping past the guards at the entrance with ease. Solara had come prepared, using her knowledge of the court's layout to avoid the most heavily guarded areas. They made their way deeper into the palace, passing through grand hallways adorned with statues and tapestries. The walls seemed to close in on them, the silence oppressive, broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps. As they neared the throne room, Jace could hear the voices of the royal council drifting through the door. He motioned for Solara to stop, his hand resting on the door handle. They were close, so close. But it wasn't just the council they had to worry about. It was the emperor himself, her father. Solara hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing against the door. The emotions that flashed across her face were quick, but Jace could see them. The uncertainty, the anger, the hurt. She was about to confront everything she had known, everything her father had built, and it wasn't going to be easy. "This is it," Jace said quietly, his voice a low murmur in the tense silence. "We're in this together." Solara nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. "We finish this now." She pushed the door open, and they stepped into the grand hall. The throne room was even more magnificent than Jace had imagined. Tall columns stretched up to the high ceiling, and the floor was covered in rich red carpets. The emperor's throne sat at the far end of the room, a symbol of his absolute power. But today, that throne would mean nothing. Today, Solara was taking her place. The royal council members stood around the throne, their expressions filled with surprise and shock as Solara and Jace entered. They had not expected her to return, not after everything that had happened. But here she was, and she wasn't backing down. The emperor, an imposing figure draped in regal robes, stood from his throne. His eyes locked onto Celara S, and for a moment the air seemed to crackle with tension. "Celara," the emperor said, his voice cold and commanding, "what are you doing here?" "I've come to end this," Celara said, her voice clear and steady. "The empire cannot continue like this. The people are suffering, and I won't stand by and let it happen any longer." The emperor's gaze hardened. "You are my daughter. You will obey your place. The Valthar Empire is built on tradition, and you will not change it." Celara took a step forward, her voice unwavering. "I'm not here to obey, I'm here to lead. I will change this empire, I will change everything." Jace watched from the side, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Celara's words were more than just a declaration, they were a promise. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her people, for a future where they could be free from the oppressive system that had held them down for so long. The Emperor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You will regret this, Celara." "Maybe," she replied. "But I'd rather regret this than live in a world where nothing ever changes." Jace could feel the tension building in the room. The council members shifted uneasily, unsure of where their loyalty lay. The Emperor's power was absolute, but Celara was something else. She was the future, and they all knew it. The Emperor's hand reached for the scepter at his side, his fingers curling around it. "You are no longer my daughter. You are a traitor to the Empire." Celara didn't flinch. "I'm not a traitor, I'm the future of this empire." The Emperor's eyes burned with rage, but before he could speak, one of the council members stepped forward. It was a woman, tall and poised, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through everything. "She's right," the woman said, her voice quiet but filled with authority. "The empire has grown corrupt. The people suffer while we live in luxury. Change is inevitable." Jace turned his head in surprise. The council member wasn't just agreeing with Celara, she was supporting her. One by one, the other council members stepped forward, their faces a mix of uncertainty and resolve. Slowly, they began to speak in support of Celara, acknowledging that the empire needed change. The emperor looked around the room, his face darkening with anger. "You would all betray me for this," he growled. "For a child who knows nothing of power, of leadership?" Celara stepped forward, her voice firm. "I may not know everything, but I know one thing: I'm ready to lead, and I will do whatever it takes to make this empire better." The emperor said nothing. His gaze hardened as he looked down at Celara, but for the first time in years, Jace saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The emperor knew that his time was up. Celara had won. "You've lost," Celara said quietly, her voice carrying through the room. "The people are ready for a new future, and I will lead them." The emperor's shoulders slumped, his pride shattered. There was nothing left for him to say. The throne no longer belonged to him. Celara turned to Jace, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it." Jace smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Together," he said. "We did it together." As they walked out of the throne room, the weight of the moment finally settled in. The empire was changing, and Celara was at the heart of that change. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But they had taken the first step toward a new future, and nothing could stop them now.